So today what we're going to be talking about is translating your process into Dubsado language. So one of the biggest things that I notice is that when I'm working with people, if I'm doing one-on-one sessions, if I'm doing webinars or anything like that, one of the biggest gaps of information is someone will write out their process. They have everything written out. They know exactly what they want to do. Maybe they already have all of their content in Dubsado. They're ready to go, but understanding how to translate what you wrote on paper or what you wrote on an Excel spreadsheet or did a mind map, how do you translate that into Dubsado language? Because if you're familiar with Dubsado, Dubsado has its own language of how the workflows work and all of that. And sometimes there's a gap of information on what did I write down and how do I put that in Dubsado language. That's what we're going to really hit on today, is understanding how to make that transition into how do I take what I wrote and put it in how Dubsado works as far as the language is concerned. So today and then tomorrow is going to be actually building the workflow. So if you are showing up for any webinar, it's probably going to be tomorrow, but I'm actually going to build the workflow live tomorrow. But today and tomorrow are kind of joined, and there's an intersection between them, because translating the process is basically just teeing you up to actually put it in the system. So with that being said, some people might look at what I'm going to do today and say, I don't really need to do that. And to be honest, some of you might not need to do what I'm going to do today, to be completely transparent. You might want to translate your process as you build your workflow, and that's totally fine too. But I wanted to kind of separate these into two different webinars so you can really understand the thought process on what I'm going to be doing when I'm translating it. And then tomorrow is actually just plugging things in. And so this webinar and tomorrow are kind of one big webinar, but I decided to split it into two so that you can kind of see the thought process on it and why I'm thinking the way I'm thinking. And then tomorrow is actually putting it into place. So that I just wanted to get out of the way, just in case someone is thinking, do I really have to do this extra work? You don't have to, but it might be helpful if you are more of like a tactile, write out exactly what's happening. So before we actually do that, there is 5 rules that I have that I've kind of compiled here. And as long as you follow these 5 rules or these guidelines, it's basically going to put you in a position where you almost can't fail when you're translating your process into Dubsado. This is kind of like when you're bowling and you have the railings that you can put up if you're not a really great bowler, and you have kind of the sides there to make sure that you're hitting pins. It's not necessarily where you're going to get a strike every time, but if you follow these 5 rules, you're basically going to hit pins every single time. This is kind of a framework, and if you follow this, you can't really mess up too much. But then when you're testing and doing all of that, maybe you want to switch a few things, but this will at least help you hit some pins, if you like that analogy. So let me go ahead and walk through these 5 rules, and then we're going to use these rules to build out the workflow and actually write out what's going to be happening. Number 1, and this is probably going to bring back some of the things we talked about last week. You might say, oh yeah, I remember when he talked about that. So it kind of has that same idea. So number 1, if you are sending a questionnaire, proposal, or sub-agreement, if you remember from last week, we talked about how that all has to do with sending a form or using after form is completed or after form is not completed. It all revolves around those 3 forms. So if you are using any of those 3, if you're sending that out, if you're emailing it to a client, you have to use send form. There is no other action that will work for that. You have to use that action. If you are sending or emailing, if you will, if you're sending a scheduler, you must use send appointment scheduler. You cannot use any other action if you're planning on emailing a scheduler to somebody, if you want to do it the right way. If you're sending an email with no Dubsado templates in there, so you're not sending a form or a scheduler or anything like that, you will use send email as your action. Those three right there already put you in such a great position to build your workflow, because then when you're translating, you're thinking, okay, I'm sending a questionnaire. I already know I'm using send form. Now I need to figure out, since I know my action already, now what other information needs to go in there. So 1 through 3, those are kind of your frameworks for actions that you're going to put in there. Number 4, we talked about this a lot on Thursday and Friday last week. Number 4, 1 form or 1 scheduler per email that goes out in each action. And we talked a lot about that last week. So if you're kind of interested in figuring out more info on that, or why that is a reason that you have to follow that rule, definitely check out some of the webinars from last week, because we dove really deep into that. And then number 5, the last one, always look for the most specific trigger possible. I talked about that in depth on Friday, and why you have to really look at what is the correct trigger to use, or the most accurate one that you can use. If nothing else works, you will use after all previous actions are complete. And once I write out the workflow here and I talk about translating it, you're going to understand why you're going to use that action or that trigger. And you might pair an after all previous actions are complete with maybe an approval button. So it's not necessarily always automatic, but maybe you'll put an approval on there. So with that being said, let's take these 5 rules and let's go into that same process that we were looking at last week. And I'm going to show you how to break this down and translate this into Dubsado workflow language. So let me pop over here. And there are some things that I removed because I had like 2 or 3 different processes written out last week. So I shortened this up a little bit so it's not as much visually to look at one time. But right up here at the top, you'll see that I have those 5 tips. I've just brought those over into Notion. So it's the exact same 5, but now they're just here. And so we don't have to pop back and forth. We can just use this the rest of the time. The other thing that I did, and I also encourage you to do this as well, if you are translating your process, is to maybe have Dubsado open on one screen and then have your process open on another, just so you can kind of see the different actions and triggers that you have to work with. If you have that kind of in front of you, if you want to take screenshots of it on your computer and just pull them up, then while you're translating it, you can look over and see what actions and triggers you can actually use. We talked about actions and triggers on Thursday and Friday last week and what each one of these mean. So while I'm using all of these today and tomorrow, you should understand why I'm picking the actions and triggers that I'm choosing to. And that's why I really wanted to spend 2 days going through every single action and every trigger. So that way, when we get to today and tomorrow, you're not confused on, well, why is he using that one? Or why is he picking that action? So I'm putting these here just so I can visually look at the list while I'm translating my process. So I have that there. Now, here's the process that we were looking at last week. And what we're going to do is actually break down every single one of these actions today. And it should move pretty quickly, but I want to show you what my thought process is on why I'm choosing some of these things here. So number 1, what I'm going to do, and if you want to do this on your Notion template, I sent this out on our second session. And if you were using Notion, you should have everything written in here. If not, you can use your Excel spreadsheet or your piece of paper, or however you did it, you can use that. But what I'm going to do is up here in the top, I'm actually going to make some new columns here. I'm just going to make 2 new columns. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make one that's called action, and I'm going to make another one that's called trigger. And what I'm going to do is all of these different actions here are the steps that I've written out. I'm actually going to write in which ones I want to use in this situation. So then when I go to my workflow, I literally just look at this and just plug it in. And it's going to be very smooth to just look at this. And this is going to be my cheat sheet when I build my workflow tomorrow. So let's start at the top. If you remember from last week, what we talked about was, if I want to make a to-do, I'm labeled that green. So everything that's in this process here, if it's green, that means it's a task that I need to get done. And based off the information that we talked about last week when we talked about actions, you can create tasks in the workflow using the create to do action. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go through, and everything on here that is green, I'm going to write create to do next to it, because that's what it is. It's a task that I need to get done. And you'll see throughout here, I have green here, here. All of these things are green because they're things that I need to get done. And so they're going to be tasks. So I'm just going to look here. And if it's green, I'm going to write create to do. And that's right there. I have one right here. So I'll write create to do. And then I don't have any in my booking process here, but I do have some in my booked. So I'm going to write create to do on this one. And then I have another one here. So we'll write create to do. We'll write another one here underneath that. And then another one here underneath that. And then I think I just have one more down here at the bottom to send out a physical thank you card that I'm going to do. So as you can see, I've only done one thing so far. I've looked through all of my different things here, all of my different steps, and anything that's green, if you highlighted your content, we talked about that in session 2 last week. If you highlight your content, I can literally just go through anything that's green, boom, create to do. So I already have actions written out for all of those. Now, let's look back at the 5 tips here. If I'm sending out a scheduler, I have to use send appointment scheduler. I cannot use any other actions. We talked about this last week on why you need to do that. It's because you need to choose the scheduler template you want to use. You need to use the scheduler link. And tomorrow, when we actually put this in, you'll see, again, kind of a repeat on why you're doing that. So if you are using a scheduler, and I put it in green or in orange here, so that way it kind of makes sense, I have to use send appointment scheduler as my action. When I'm looking through this list here, the one that I'm going to use right there, it's not send email, it will be send appointment scheduler. So anywhere where there's orange on here, I'm going to basically plug in and put in send appointment scheduler. So I have one going out there. So this would be send appointment scheduler. And then I only have one more, and it's down here, which would be my 2-month check-in. So here I'm going to do send appointment scheduler. Okay. So once we have that in there, those are the only things scheduler wise that I'm using in here. I don't have any other schedulers that are being sent. So those are the only 2 send appointment scheduler actions that I'm going to use. Now let's get to forms here. If you remember from the top up here, and I have this on the outline, when sending a form, so if it's a questionnaire, proposal, or sub-agreement, those are considered the forms that you're using the form link with, and you're also going to be using the send form action. Those 3 will always be used there. So if I'm sending out a questionnaire, proposal, or sub-agreement, I have to use send form. So now what am I going to do? I'm going to go down here, and anywhere where I see blue, I'm going to put in send form. Very simple here. So here's, I'm sending out a pre-consultation questionnaire. So I'm going to put send form. And then we talked about this on Friday last week. If you're using after form is completed or after form is not completed, you can basically choose send form again, and you can resend that form out to the client. As long as it's a questionnaire, proposal, or sub-agreement, you can resend that back out to the client if they don't complete it after a certain amount of time. So here, if I'm resending that questionnaire out to a client, I can do the exact same thing here. I could say send form in there because I'm resending that back out to the client. Now let's go down to the booking workflow here. If I have sending out my proposal to the client, same idea. I'm going to do send form here. Now, there's something that I didn't have in my previous process that I've added in, and it's literally because last week I figured out how to do something that is groundbreaking, actually. And this is going to be the first time that I'm actually going to talk about it on a webinar and actually show you how to do this. But I added in an extra step it's called Start the Contract Follow-Up Workflow. There's a lot of questions that we get with people that what do we do if someone does not sign the contract? And I want to remind them to do that. If you remember from last week when we were looking at different triggers, we don't have after contract is not signed. If you're looking at all of these triggers here, we have after contract is signed, but we don't have anything if they don't sign it. But literally last week, I figured out how to do it where you can send out follow-ups if they don't sign their contract. And tomorrow, I'm actually going to show you how to put this in so that if you are sending out a proposal and contract invoice combination, or maybe you're just sending out a contract by itself, I'm going to show you how to actually send out follow-ups if they don't sign it. So I have in here, and I'm going to start actually implementing this anytime I build a workflow. And I added this in there so that tomorrow I can actually show you how to put that together. So because I'm going to be starting a workflow, the action that I would want to use here would be start a workflow. Obviously, it kind of makes sense there. There's not really anything else that would fit if I'm wanting to start a new workflow. So here we can just plug in really quickly, start a workflow, because that's going to be the action that I would use there. Right now, we're just worried about actions. We're going to be worried about triggers next, but we're just kind of going through this and plugging in different things. So here, I'm wanting to resend out my proposal. It's the exact same thing if they don't fill out this pre-consultation questionnaire. I want to resend that form out to them. So again, I'm just going to be doing send form on these two actions here. So here, since it's a proposal, we're going to do send form. And we're going to do the same thing on this one here. And then this is lead becomes a job. I have this written in there because we talked about this on Wednesday of last week in session 2. We talked about how important it is when you're writing out the answers to those 6 questions we talked about, what makes a lead a job, and you should be including that when you wrote out your process. So I have this in there just so I know when a lead becomes a job. Now, on, let's see, it'll be Wednesday, we're going to talk about project status changes, and we're going to talk about all that fun stuff and streamlining. So we're actually just going to leave this blank for right now. We're not going to worry about this. So if you are using this template or writing out your process, when you have written in when a lead becomes a job, don't worry about the action right now. We're going to talk about that on Wednesday. So I have pretty much everything in my inquiry and my booking workflow already set up as far as actions go. Okay, now let's get to the booked section here. So I have create to do there. This one is activate the client portal. So if I'm looking at my actions, which one would make the most sense? Activate portal, right? So in here on this action, we're just going to copy that. So activate portal is going to be my action there. Then I have send out a welcome wedding packet. That's a questionnaire that I've created. So this one, super easy, send form. You know exactly what it is there. Then I'm sending out a client portal guide, which is a questionnaire. So I'm going to send that to them. So this is actually going to be send form as well. Then I'm sending out a 3-month check-in email, but nothing else is going to be with it. So what action would I use if I'm sending out something with no other attachments in there? Well, if we go back up to the top and we look at this, if I'm sending out anything that doesn't have a form or a proposal, a scheduler, then I'm just going to use send email. Like I said, if you follow these 5, you're basically going to be right there. You might have to make some adjustments once you test things out. You might want to switch some things, but this is basically going to get you there just by following these simple 5 rules. So now, if I'm sending out an email here, this is just an email, nothing else. I'm going to do send email for this action. Then I have send appointment scheduler. I already have that in there. Then I have a 1-month check-in email. So that would again be send email because there's nothing else going out with it. Then I have a review questionnaire. Once we're done with everything, I'm sending out a review questionnaire to them, but it's a questionnaire. So I'm just going to look at that blue. Honestly, since it's blue, I automatically know that it's going to be send form. Then I have create to do. Then I have anniversary email. That's going to be going out to them a year after the project is over, but there's nothing going out with it. It's just a plain anniversary email. So that's going to be send email. And then the last thing is that I want to archive the project. And we talked about that on Thursday last week if you want to archive that project. So this one would be archive project. And for those of you who might not have been in some of those sessions last week, just looking at this list, we have an archive project option there. So I'm going to use that one at the very end. So now we're literally halfway through this already. Just by doing the prep work that we did last week, where we wrote out the process, we highlighted our content. If I was going through this quickly and I'm not explaining everything that I'm doing, I would literally do it this way. If it's green, create to do. Orange, I already know it's send appointment scheduler. If I see blue, it's send form. If it's just red by itself, which would be like down here, it's send email. I would have flown through this just by looking at the color scheme that I have. So I explained it a little bit more, but you can see how fast it is to just plug in these actions here. Once we're done with this, now we're going to move on to this trigger section over here. If you have a Excel spreadsheet, you could literally just make another column if you wanted to, or if you're on Notion, there's a little plus button up there. So if you want to add more columns, you can do that if you want to. But now we're just going to transition, and now we're going to be looking at this list over here. And again, a good reason why you should keep this up here is if you need sort of like a cheat sheet or a reminder of what triggers are possible, then you might have this on the side of the screen, maybe open up a new window so you can look at that. All I did was I screenshotted on my computer the two different lists, and then I just brought them into Notion. So if you're familiar with Notion, you can do that. But this is really helpful if you're looking at this, trying to decide what trigger, and then looking at the list here on what would be the best option. So now let's check out the triggers here. So the very first thing that I want to have happen once this workflow starts is to have a to-do to review the inquiry form and check for the availability. So if you remember from Friday, anytime that we want something to happen as soon as the workflow begins, once that lead capture form gets filled out and it starts the workflow, we're going to be using after workflow started. One thing I didn't mention on Friday last week, and we do get this question quite a bit, is what if at the very first action I use after all previous actions complete? Will that still work? And the answer is yes. When you're talking about your very first trigger at the top, if you use after all previous actions are complete or after workflow started, it does the exact same thing, because if this was after all previous actions are complete, there's nothing above it to get done. So the workflow sees that and then it just fills it in. The reason I never use that trigger is actually kind of petty. I don't use it because it just doesn't make sense to me that there's nothing above it. So I wouldn't use that trigger. You don't have to use that logic if you want to use that, but just looking at it, since there's nothing above it, why would I use that trigger? But it does work. So here I'm going to put after workflow started as my trigger. Because it just looks better to me, to be honest. So that's going to be my first trigger. Now, this next one here is going to be send out the appointment scheduler once I approve the lead. Now, here's where it gets tricky, because a lot of people are trying to think, okay, well, what trigger is going to work well for that? And another reason why I want you, and why I said to write out your process in the language that you would use, notice that last week when I was writing out my process, I didn't actually put in the actual triggers here. I put in the language of what I would actually use as soon as the client inquires, once I approve the lead, immediately after they book their consultation. Those are not Dubsado trigger languages that I immediately wrote in there. but here's how you can translate it in a way that works. If I say I want to send out my appointment scheduler once I approve the lead, if I look at this list here, what would make the most sense if I said after I approve the lead? There's nothing in this list that says once you approve a lead. So if we go back to those 5 rules, always try to find the most specific trigger possible. If nothing is available, which if you look at that trigger, once I approve the lead, there isn't anything available that would make sense here because it's a task that I'm getting done. So I'm going to use after all previous actions are complete. Maybe I put an approve button on there, which if you see here, I have one on there, maybe not. You can play around with that, but that's why if you're writing out your process and you say, well, no triggers work for this, then you're probably going to use after all previous actions are complete as just kind of the default, put it in there. And then maybe you have an approve button, maybe you don't. This will also make a little bit more sense when we do this visually tomorrow, and you'll see why if you use that trigger, why it's going to make more sense. So in here, I'm going to say after all previous actions, and I'm just going to leave it like that. I'm not going to write the rest in there, but after all previous actions. Okay. So then the next thing, I want to send out a questionnaire immediately after they book their consultation. So let's look at this list here. What would work best for as soon as they book their consultation? Well, we have after an appointment is scheduled. So that's going to be the one because that literally fits with what I'm trying to do. As soon as they book that consultation, that's going to be the one. And if you remember from Friday, what I said was, the more that you understand what these triggers are, you probably won't even have to really look at this list because you're going to know what's possible with your triggers. I'm looking through this list right now at what works best. After they sign the contract, no. Invoice paid, no. After they fill out a form, no. So I can do process of elimination. If I'm not familiar with these, I could literally go through each one and then figure out, okay, well, after an appointment is scheduled, that one really works. So now here I can say after appointment is scheduled. So that's going to be the trigger there that I'm going to use. So now the next thing, I want to resend the questionnaire in a follow-up email if they haven't filled out the questionnaire in 24 hours. So basically what that means is that they haven't filled out a form in 24 hours. So if I'm looking at this list, well, we have after form is not completed. And we talked about the triggers last week that if it's a questionnaire, proposal, or subagreement, I'm going to use after form is not completed there. So that's literally if they haven't filled out the questionnaire in 24 hours, I want to resend that. So this trigger is going to be after form is not completed. Pretty easy there because I'm just looking at what I wrote and then looking at this trigger list. Next thing, prepare for the consultation 24 hours before the consultation. So they've booked their appointment. So now let me look at this list. Well, I probably know I'm going to be using an appointment trigger because it's based off of their consultation. So that already eliminates project dates if they haven't filled out the form or invoicing. All of that's out the window. So I could use before an appointment start time because I'm watching for that consultation. So 24 hours before their consultation, I want to create a to-do. So this would be before an appointment start time. Pretty easy there. So now we already have the inquiry workflow already done. If I wanted to, if I had all my content in the system, I could go in right now and I could plug this in extremely quickly. And you can see how easy it is where just by either process of elimination or just following these 5 rules up here, you can easily plug in your workflow now because you've done that prep work in order to do so. So now let's move to the booking workflow here. So I want to send a form here once my booking workflow, well, actually, let me stop for a second here. I want to send out my proposal after the consultation has ended. What I'm going to do, I'm actually going to do this the wrong way. The reason I'm going to do it the wrong way, and I already know ahead of time what adjustments I'm going to make tomorrow, but I want to do it in a way where if you're writing this workflow, this is probably what you're going to do. But when we go tomorrow, you're going to see where you can make some adjustments. So I'm going to follow my own rules here, even though I know I'm going to change it tomorrow. I'm going to follow my own rules. So after the consultation has ended, so let's see here, out of this list, after an appointment has ended, obviously that is the clear-cut answer here. So in this action, I'm going to do after appointment has ended. Pretty easy there. Okay, next one. I want to start the workflow after I send out the proposal and contract. So let's look at this trigger list. Do I have anything in here that is after I send out the proposal and contract to the client? I don't. There's nothing like that in here. So what am I going to use? After all previous actions are complete. So after all previous actions. Next, I want to resend the proposal if they haven't filled out the proposal in 3 days. We're going to use that exact same logic that we did up here with that questionnaire. So here I'm going to do after form is not completed. Same idea. We're using that same logic. It's a proposal. So that means that I can resend it out if they don't complete it. And then we're going to skip over this one here. The lead becomes a job, and we'll save that for Wednesday. So boom. I already have my booking workflow already set up here just by following those 5 guidelines. And now let's move to the booked workflow, and then we'll pretty much be wrapped up for the day. This one is going to be pretty quick, this webinar, and then I'll be able to answer some questions here. So now, the booked workflow. So I want to do this after the client has signed the contract. So if we go up to the top here, we do have after contract is signed by client. Very simple. So in my list here, I have after the client has signed the contract. So this would be after contract is signed. Very simple. Same thing with this one, after the client has signed the contract. So we're going to do the same thing. As long as you wrote in detail, which we talked about on Wednesday last week, if you wrote out in detail exactly when you want things to happen, then it's easier to plug in the right trigger. If you just said here, I want to send out or I want to create these tasks later, and you wrote later in this when section, now you're going to be very confused on what trigger you're actually going to use. So that's why it was so important last week that when you wrote out your process to make it as specific as possible, because now you can look at this list up here and have more context on what you're doing. So now I want to set the portal password for the client. It's a task. After the client portal is activated, because I just activated it the step before. So I want to do this right after. If I see after the client portal is activated, let's see if we have that trigger. And we don't. There is no after the client portal is activated in my list. So number 5 up here, I'm going to use after all previous actions. So after all previous actions. Now, after the password is set, so I want to add my Pinterest board to the client portal after I set the password. So if I do that, there's nothing in that list that once you set a portal password triggers something. So I'm going to use after all previous actions. After adding the Pinterest board, I want to add a Google Drive folder to the client portal. So there's nothing in that list. So again, we're going to do after all previous actions. If I wanted to here, I could throw some approve buttons on there. That's kind of like what I talked about up here. If you want to put approve buttons on there, you can. You don't have to, but that's going to be your trigger. Now, after I get done adding the Google Drive folder, I want to upload my welcome packet into the portal. I don't have anything in my trigger list that says Google Drive folder or anything remotely like that. So this is also after all previous actions. And then I want to email out my portal guide to the client, and I'm actually going to send out my portal information to them in this email after I upload the welcome packet. But I don't have anything in here that is going to be after I upload a welcome packet. So we're going to do the exact same thing again. This might sound extremely redundant, but when I'm building my workflow, It's going to be very simple because I've already laid out literally every action and trigger ahead of time. So now the next thing is 3 months until the actual event. So 3 months before their actual project date or their event date. I actually made a mistake here. I actually wrote this out in Dubsado language, so that's my fault. It's just force of habit. But if you put 3 months before the event or 3 months before the wedding, that also works too. But now we have all of these, as you can see, all of these are project date related, or 3 months before the wedding, 2 months before the wedding, 1 month before the photo shoot, or whatever the case may be. You can use these project date triggers. So now in this list, I'm using these 4. That's all I'm going to be using here. So if I do 3 months before the project date, pretty simple, 3 months before project date, 2 months before the project date. So I'm just going to fill this in. This might seem redundant, and that's kind of like when I said at the beginning of the actual webinar, maybe while you're translating this, you're actually building your workflow at the same time. You could do that if you wanted to, but just for the purposes of this webinar, it is helpful to split up my mindset into one webinar and then actually building it tomorrow. So let's go here. We'll do 1 month before project date, very simple. 1 week after the project date, and then 1 month after project date, really easy there. And then we have 1 year after project date, so we'll plug that in. And then one last thing here, I want to archive the project after everything else has happened. I literally wrote that word for word, after everything else has happened. So what would that be? Because there's nothing else that says after everything else has happened. So you would say after all previous actions are complete. That would be the trigger that you would use there. So now literally I have my entire workflow. If I wanted to go in and build this right now, I could get the entire thing done immediately, because what I've done is I've laid out every action and trigger on what it is that I'm going to do with each step. And if we go back up to the top, all I did was I followed this framework here. I followed this step by step, and as long as I followed those, I'm going to get extremely close to what I want to do. Now, I already know there's going to be some things in here that tomorrow I'm going to show you where you have to pivot a little bit, but at least when you're here, you're going to be 80–90% there, and then maybe through testing or things like that, maybe you want to remove some emails, or maybe you want to add some things in there, but that's why we're going to talk about that at the end of the week. But when you're here, you're literally 85–90% there. There's just a few other things that you would need to do. So that's really all that I have for today, is to show you how you can take what you have written out. As long as you've done this prep work over here on the left-hand side, these 2 columns here should be fairly easy to put into place. And then tomorrow we're going to jump in and we're actually going to build out this workflow, and I'm going to show you how to basically put it in and then maybe make a few tweaks based off of what we've built. Okay.